Have you ever felt that warning that doesn't make sense, but somehow feels more real than everything around you? This question resonates because at some point in our lives we've all experienced that strange feeling. A restlessness that arises in the silence of the night, a persistent thought, almost like a whisper we didn't ask to hear, but which refuses to go away. And it is precisely at this moment, where the invisible touches the real, that today's story begins. They were about to go to sleep. The house was quiet, the wind outside seemed to be resting, and everything indicated that this would be just another ordinary night. But then, something changed. A weight on their chest, a presence that couldn't be seen but could be felt, and a phrase that pierced their minds like a lightning bolt cutting through the darkness. Get out of here. It was so clear, so urgent, so impossible to ignore that, for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Have you ever experienced that? That feeling that something bigger is trying to warn you before disaster strikes? While many would dismiss it as mere paranoia, they knew deep down that the warning carried something sacred, something prophetic. And when we talk about prophecies with its signs and spiritual discernment, it's impossible not to notice how these seemingly small moments can change entire destinies. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. Imagine this scene as if it were a movie. The dim light of a lamp, the accelerated breathing, the exchange of glances that says everything without needing words. There was no noise, no movement, only that voice echoing inside, pushing them away, as if time itself were warning that something was about to happen. And it is at this point that many ignore the call, but they did not ignore it. What if you were there? What if that warning was for you? When we talk about moments like these, it's impossible not to remember how many times the scriptures recount warnings that changed lives. Alerts that arose in the early morning, signs that revealed themselves when everything seemed too calm. The spiritual world doesn't work according to human logic, and sometimes a feeling, a word, a discomfort in the soul can be the first indication of a great deliverance. Perhaps you yourself have experienced this tension between the calling voice and the fear of obeying. Perhaps you have hesitated to take a step because you didn't know where that strong feeling came from. But there are rare and decisive moments when ignoring the warning can cost much more than we imagine. And that's where this story becomes so powerful, because it reminds us that there are signs that appear not to frighten, but to save. What you are about to hear is not just a story, it's an invitation to see beyond, to understand how, in ordinary situations, God can use something seemingly simple to move someone to the right place at the right time. And when we understand that, everything changes. So take a deep breath, adjust your mind, and allow yourself to enter this narrative as if you were living every detail. Because the warning they received that night wasn't just a sound in their conscience. It was a divine intervention that would change everything. And as we move forward, you'll understand why that phrase, "Get out of here," it was more than a warning. It was the beginning of something no one expected. Now, let's move on to the next point, where everything begins to unfold with even greater intensity. And while that phrase, "Get out of here," it still vibrated in the air, and something curious began to happen within them. It wasn't just fear, nor just intuition. It was as if a silent understanding was forming, a clarity that didn't come from the mind, but from the spirit. And perhaps, as you listen to this now, some part of you also remembers a similar moment, a sign that touched your soul in an unexpected way. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what touched you the most. Sometimes someone's experience illuminates another person's path. It's amazing how stories like this create a kind of invisible link between those who experience them and those who listen. And that's why, if something inside you has been awakened, however small, sharing your perception makes a difference. When you comment, you're not just interacting with a video. You're helping to build a community where each story, each reflection, each detail has the power to strengthen those on the other side of the screen. And of course, if this narrative has captivated you so far, take a second to breathe and leave a like. It's not just a quick gesture. It's a clear sign that this type of content matters to you. Believe me, each like helps this video reach more people who, like you, are seeking understanding, guidance, or simply a moment of deep connection with something greater. And if you feel this is the kind of message you want to keep following, subscribe to the channel. This is where you'll find stories, revelations, reflections, and signs that often go unnoticed in the rush of life. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. And that makes a huge difference in ensuring that messages like this continue to be produced and spread. Because ultimately, everything we're sharing together, this warning, this mystery, this feeling of something bigger moving, isn't just about an ancient story. It's about us. About how each person who comes here brings with them a piece of this spiritual experience that connects us in invisible ways. And as we move forward, almost like someone walking down a dark corridor before opening the main door, something even bigger begins to reveal itself. They weren't different from you or me. They were an ordinary family, the kind that lives amidst commitments, small dreams, and the routine everyone knows well. They woke up early, tidied the house, made coffee, thought about the month's bills, planned for the future within their means. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that caught attention. Life went on at such a normal pace that anyone could look from the outside and say, "They're fine. Everything is in order." And it really seemed to be. His job was stable, the kind that brings a sense of security, or at least an illusion of it. She took care of the home and managed every detail with the lightness of someone who understands that, deep down, family is a living organism that breathes love, dialogue, and patience. The children grew up healthy, full of energy, running around the house while inventing stories and little adventures. The surrounding community was peaceful, with neighbors who greeted each other by name and strangers who became acquaintances along the way. There was no sign of danger, no shadow announcing change. It was a life built on routines that seemed eternal. But that's precisely why that warning became so disconcerting. Because when everything seems stable, the last thing we expect is to see the invisible disrupt the everyday. And perhaps that's where the strength of this story lies, in the contrast between the common and the extraordinary, between normality and the revelation that arrives uninvited. Could be any one of us. It could be you receiving that profound impression in the middle of the night, that silent message that cuts through the air with the clarity of a calling. The fact that it was a simple family, with a seemingly ordinary life, makes everything even more real and impactful. They weren't people accustomed to grand visions. They didn't have a life marked by mysteries or continuous spiritual events. They lived their journey like so many others, balancing responsibilities, shelved dreams, and small daily victories. And that's precisely why the warning was so transformative. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we look behind the scenes of this story, we realize that the warning didn't come out of nowhere. It was as if something was happening in the invisible, silent, slow, almost imperceptible, but totally real world. Their lives might have seemed the same on the surface, but there were small signs that would only make sense later. Those nights when he came home from work with a strange feeling he couldn't explain. That afternoon when she stopped for a few seconds at the door of the house, feeling something in the air without understanding why. Small details that seemed irrelevant, but that, somehow, prepared the ground for what was to come. And here's something many ignore. Sometimes the greatest impact of our story begins precisely in what we don't perceive. A subtle change in mindset, a discomfort that appears and disappears, a seemingly random conversation, a thought that insists on returning. What seemed like mere routine carried hidden truths that would only be revealed at the right moment. And when that warning echoed, so unexpected and so urgent, everything that previously seemed disconnected began to take shape, like pieces of a puzzle that finally fit together. The more we understand this family's situation, the more we realize that the transformation didn't begin in the early hours of the morning with the warning. It began much earlier, in the quiet days, in the small gestures, in the decisions that seemed unimportant. Because life is like that. Sometimes something grand is announced long before it happens, but we only see it when we look back. And perhaps you've already experienced something similar, that period when everything seemed normal, but inside something was changing, preparing you for a decisive moment. They were people of faith, but a faith lived in everyday life, not the kind expressed in grand speeches. It was the faith that appears in patience, in care, in the way they dealt with adversity, in the hope they held on to even in difficult times. And this kind of faith, silent and constant, creates a different kind of sensitivity, even if we don't realize it. The warning that night found fertile ground, even if they didn't know it. And when they realized the weight of that phrase, "Get out of here," it was as if everything inside them had been rearranged in seconds. But why would such a strong warning come to an ordinary family, living an apparently peaceful life? Perhaps because these moments of rupture happen precisely where we least expect them. Perhaps because the simplicity of the scenario makes the revelation even more profound. Or perhaps because, deep down, the extraordinary always manifests itself where there is space to listen, even when the natural ear doesn't understand. And when we look at their story, we realize that nothing there was a coincidence. The job that seemed secure, the house that seemed permanent, the community that seemed stable, all of this would be part of a transition they never imagined facing. The truth is that great turning points don't always begin with grand events. Often they begin with something that seems small, but carries enormous force. And when that night arrived, bringing an inexplicable weight to the atmosphere, everything that seemed so certain began to shift. There was no noise, no physical sign, but there was an impulse overflowing from within, demanding decision, courage, and a sudden change of direction. And it is at this point in the story that we realize how seemingly simple decisions can determine the course of an entire journey. The feeling that overwhelmed them wasn't just fear, it was insight. It was as if every part of their body was responding to something their minds didn't yet understand. And this reveals a hidden truth that many ignore. Sometimes, what moves us isn't logic, it's intuition. It's not rationality, it's spiritual perception. It's not analysis, it's revelation. And when these elements come together, life is reconfigured in a way that seems impossible to reverse. And it is precisely at this point that the story takes on a different dimension, because when they decided to heed that warning, something within them aligned in a new way, as if an invisible door opened, inviting them to cross over into a territory entirely different from what they were used to. This moment marked the beginning of a transformation that would change everything. The way they saw the world, the way they interpreted signs, the very idea of safety. Nothing would be the same after that night. And as we continue exploring this journey, each detail begins to reveal more than it seemed at first glance. Every gesture, every sensation, every fragment of memory becomes part of a larger web that continues to unfold. Before we proceed, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. The unease didn't begin abruptly. In fact, it arose like those small waves that touch the sand before a large tide. At first, almost imperceptible. One night when he took longer than usual to fall asleep. Another when she woke up in the middle of the night for no reason, with a racing heart and a feeling difficult to put into words. None of this seemed serious, nothing that indicated danger. It was just different. A slight but persistent discomfort, as if the air were denser, as if the silence carried some kind of hidden message. And it's curious how life does this. Before a great transformation, something inside us begins to move, even when we don't yet understand the behind-the-scenes workings of that movement. The days continued as usual. Work, responsibilities, the routine that waits for no one. But behind it all, there was a weight that wouldn't go away. He began to have sleepless nights, the kind where the body is exhausted, but the mind finds no rest. She noticed that her prayers, which had previously flowed smoothly, began to become more intense, almost tense, as if she were pulling something from the depths of her soul. It wasn't fear, it wasn't ordinary anxiety, but a sense of urgency, a silent calling that came without explanation. And the most striking thing is that, despite sharing this unease, neither of them could quite explain what was happening. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely here that many people don't realize the magnitude of the impact that a spiritual change can have on daily life. The restlessness wasn't just an isolated feeling. It was a warning, a hidden truth trying to emerge ahead of time. They would wake up in the middle of the night with the impression that something in the environment had changed. Sometimes it was a feeling of presence. Other times, the certainty that they should pray even without understanding why. They couldn't explain it, but they knew it wasn't something common. And the more they tried to go on with their lives normally, the more this discomfort grew, as if it were pushing them towards a new mindset. It's as if a silent light begins to ignite within, revealing pieces of a story that hadn't yet unfolded. And it happens to more people than you imagine. There are moments when the spirit perceives before the mind. Moments when something inside us awakens and prepares us for what is to come, even when, externally, everything seems the same. He began to feel a tightness in his chest whenever he tried to ignore that sensation. She, in turn, began to have strange dreams, not nightmares, but dreams full of symbolism, as if they were coded messages trying to get her attention. The most curious thing is that, despite this growing unease, everything around them continued to function perfectly. The family remained united, the house remained peaceful, work flowed smoothly. And that's where the confusion increases, because when the environment is calm, the mind tends to doubt what the spirit is trying to say. They question themselves several times. Is it just tiredness? Are we exaggerating? Is it just a phase? But deep down, something insisted on remaining. An impulse that wouldn't disappear. A kind of internal pressure that had no logical explanation. It was as if every part of their being was saying, "Pay attention," and it wasn't a clear warning. There was no audible voice at that moment. There was no sight. There was no physical sign to confirm any risk. It was just unease, pure, raw, profound. But that's precisely what makes this phase so intense. Because when something inside you starts throbbing strongly, even without apparent reason, it's impossible to ignore for long. The nights began to feel too long. The mornings seemed to arrive more quickly than usual, as if the body were living at a disjointed pace, without answers to keep up with that urgency. They tried to talk about it, but they didn't know how. It was difficult to put into words a feeling that still had no form. A premonition cannot be described, it is felt. And they were feeling something big approaching, even if they didn't yet know what it was. Their prayer changed. It was no longer just gratitude or everyday requests. There were silent pleas, questions, tears that arose for no apparent reason, as if the soul was trying to prepare itself for something that the eyes could not yet see. And when two people begin to feel the same kind of unease, at the same time, without anything around them justifying it, something is happening. It's not a coincidence. It's alignment. It's as if a door were being opened in the invisible, and everything within them was being drawn into this new, unknown, but inevitable space. The sense of urgency increased each day. Not a desperate urgency, but one that demands vigilance, attention, perception. It was as if time were accelerating around them, pushing them towards a specific point in the journey, where the revelations would finally make sense. They couldn't explain why, but they knew it wasn't just in their minds. It was something that touched them deeper, that transcended reason. Something that awakened a strange force, both gentle and powerful, that kept them alert. And the more the unease grew, the more they felt they were on the verge of something that would completely transform what they understood as security, routine, and direction. And as this feeling intensified, small things began to catch their attention. Things that had previously seemed insignificant, but which now took on a different meaning. It was as if the world around them was giving subtle signals, moving pieces that they would only truly perceive when they looked back. And it is here that the story begins to approach that point where the spiritual and the natural inevitably collide, revealing that none of that unease was by chance. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. They could no longer ignore the weight they felt in their chests. The restlessness that had once seemed like just a subtle shadow had now become almost constant, like a silent pulse drawing their attention to something bigger. The sleepless nights piled up, and each dawn brought a new sensation, as if the world around them was moving too fast, while they tried to understand what was happening inside them. It was that strange mixture of urgency and confusion, as if the soul were speaking louder than the mind could keep up with. And when we reach that point, there is no other way out but to seek answers. It was then, in an almost motionless dawn, the whole house immersed in silence, that they decided to do what many do when their hearts ache in a way that cannot be explained: to kneel. There was no script, no rehearsed words, just a sincere, almost desperate, but profoundly true cry. The prayers that night were neither beautiful nor organized. They were raw. They were tears. They were formless questions. It was the kind of prayer that comes when the spirit senses danger before life shows any visible sign. And while they prayed, something began to happen. Not outside, but within them. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this moment of sincere searching was a turning point. He knelt down, his hands trembling, trying to understand why that feeling wouldn't leave him in peace. He began by asking for clarity, but soon realized he was asking for more than that. He was asking for direction. He was asking for protection. He was asking for strength to face something that didn't yet have a name. And when he closed his eyes, he felt as if the surrounding environment had changed density, as if someone had entered the room, not physically but spiritually, bringing a presence that left no doubt. He couldn't explain it in words, but later described it as if he had been literally pulled out of where he was. "I felt as if someone had pulled me out of the place," he said, trying to translate something that transcended all logic. Meanwhile, she was also praying, but in another room of the house. And the curious thing is that their experiences, although physically separated, connected in an invisible way. She felt something she had never felt before, a mixture of firmness and alertness, as if a silent, yet absolutely clear voice was saying within her, "Prepare yourself." They weren't audible words, but they were as real as if someone were standing beside her, whispering. That was the first direct answer, the point at which the unease gained meaning. The moment when the sincere search found a revelation. And here's something powerful. When the soul places itself in a position of humility and surrender, the spiritual responds. Not theatrically, not with lightning, thunder, or exaggerated sensations, but with a precision that only those who have experienced it understand. They weren't in a temple, they weren't in a service, they weren't surrounded by people. They were there, alone, in the middle of the night, kneeling in the silence of an ordinary house. But it was there that the answer came, direct, firm, and impossible to ignore. His feeling of being pulled out of place was more than an isolated experience. It was a change of direction, an internal realignment that showed something was being diverted, repositioned, protected. The "prepare yourself," she heard, however, wasn't a warning of fear, but of preparation. It was as if God were opening a curtain and saying, "You will understand everything soon, but for now, pay attention." And this combination, his spiritual displacement and the direct warning to her, formed the first clear piece of the puzzle. And when two different answers point in the same direction, there's no denying that something is being prepared behind the scenes. The transformation that had been growing within them found an anchor point. They were no longer just restless, they were being guided. And this completely changed their mindset. It was no longer just about discomfort, now it was about purpose. They felt they were being led to an important decision, something that would affect the entire family's journey. And even without fully understanding, peace began to mingle with alertness. That strange peace that only appears when we understand that we are not facing something alone. The early morning hours passed slowly, as if time had been extended so they could absorb every detail of that experience. And when the first light of day streamed through the window, they knew that something fundamental had changed. Nothing around them seemed different, but inside them everything was rearranged. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. The answer had come clear and profound, and, even without knowing what would come next, they understood that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Before we move on, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. It was impressive how that warning still echoed inside, as if it had been engraved on my soul. The atmosphere of the house seemed to change, not because of something visible, but because of a new sensitivity, like when you realize that the environment is charged with meaning, even if no one has said anything. I tried to follow the routine, but everything seemed out of place, as if every detail was pointing to something bigger, something I hadn't yet fully understood. But while I was trying to get organized, that's precisely when the confirmation came, not in that predictable way we sometimes imagine, but in such a direct way that it seemed to touch the very structure of life, as if it were a call for a change of mindset. I was sitting there, still somewhat uneasy about everything that had happened, when someone entered the room and said something that struck exactly at the heart of my doubt. It wasn't someone who knew what I was going through. They had no idea about my search, my prayer, the tightness in my chest I had felt hours before. They simply said something that seemed to fit word for word what I had silently asked for, as if they had read a secret report of my anxieties. It was so specific, so precise, that I could only stand there, staring, trying to disguise the feeling that the world had stopped for a few seconds. It was as if that simple phrase carried a hidden revelation, something that transcended any coincidence. And before I could compose myself, my gaze fell precisely on the verse I wasn't looking for, but which found me like an answer, almost like a reminder from heaven saying, "I am in control." The text wasn't marked, it wasn't set aside, it wasn't planned. I simply opened the Bible as if trying to breathe a little peace, and there it was, a line that seemed to pierce my skin and touch my spirit directly, with a force I didn't know I still needed to feel. It was as if God were stitching together the backstage of my journey, uniting pieces I didn't even imagine were part of the same puzzle. And the most curious thing is that, on that same day, two other people, completely random, totally disconnected from each other, spoke about exactly the same topic. Neither of them knew about my prayer. Neither had any idea what was happening inside my house. And yet, they all repeated the same pattern of words, as if they were reading an invisible script, guided by something greater than logic or chance. I began to realize that when heaven wants to speak, it speaks in a way that leaves no doubt, as if reality itself were being pushed to align everything around a single direction. It was as if the confirmation was approaching me in layers. First the feeling, then the word, then the people, and finally that profound silence that only those who have felt it can explain. A different kind of silence, full of impact, as if the atmosphere were saying, "Do you understand now?" And at that moment, even trying to remain calm, I realized that something within me had repositioned itself. The feeling was one of spiritual authority, of someone who knows they are not inventing things in their own head, but are receiving a real, consistent, irrefutable warning. And it didn't stop there. There was a moment when I went into the room, just to catch my breath and try to organize my thoughts, and I felt a light weight, not the kind that weighs you down, but the kind that aligns you. It's hard to put into words, but it felt like someone had literally adjusted me from the inside, as if God were saying, "Pay attention, I am guiding you." And while I was trying to absorb all of that, my heart raced in a strange way, not out of fear, but out of awareness. As if the whole sky was shouting, "Now!" Not as desperate urgency, but as sure direction. As if something was being released at that very instant. I realized that confirmations like this don't happen by chance. They come to align decisions, to reveal what was hidden in the cracks of daily life, to bring to light truths that previously went unnoticed. It's as if God were saying, "I don't want you to just feel, I want you to see." And when that happens, everything changes, the way we look at life, the way we interpret details, the way we move forward. Because when God insists on confirming something, He is building within us an understanding that goes beyond the moment. It's a silent transformation that changes the way we see purpose and the future. And while I was in that whirlwind of understanding and surprise, I realized that each piece was being put in place so intentionally that it was impossible to ignore. It was as if time itself was collaborating with what God wanted to reveal. And this made me understand that some answers don't just come to calm the heart, they come to prepare. They come to shape the mindset, to reposition us, to remind us of what really matters. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because when a confirmation comes like this, it doesn't end there. It opens doors, exposes behind-the-scenes events, reveals intentions from heaven that have been building for much longer than we imagine. And that's exactly where the story begins to expand in a way that transforms everything around it. If this makes sense to you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. It was impossible not to realize that all of this had been more than just a simple warning. It was as if God were holding up a mirror to me, not to reveal flaws, but to show me paths, opportunities for change, blind spots that I would never have identified on my own. The confirmation didn't just come to calm me down, it came to awaken me. And the more I reflected on all of this, the more I understood that those signs weren't isolated. They were part of a larger movement, a kind of spiritual alignment that doesn't happen by chance. It's curious how life sometimes seems to follow an automatic rhythm, until something breaks the routine and makes us realize that there's a purpose being built behind the scenes, far beyond what we can see at first glance. And that's when this thought really started to bother me. How many times does God try to warn us and we simply ignore it? Not out of pure rebellion, but out of distraction, because we are too busy with the noise of expectations, responsibilities, and other people's opinions. The hidden truth is that, many times, He speaks before acting, but our souls are so full of things that we can't perceive when heaven calls us by name. And it's not a threatening warning, on the contrary. It's care, love, protection. It's the kind of warning that doesn't seek to frighten, but to align. That doesn't come to punish us, but to prevent us from getting lost along the way. While I was thinking about this, I realized that we almost always expect complete explanations, as if God were obligated to detail every step, every reason, every consequence. But the spiritual journey doesn't work that way. He doesn't always explain. He doesn't always give details of the process. But even in silence, He protects. And when this awareness truly descends into the heart, something profoundly changes within us. It's an internal transformation, a change of mindset that is worth more than any immediate answer. We begin to perceive the subtle signs, to value the small confirmations, to understand that there are moments when God simply wants us to trust, even when everything around us seems confusing. And this reflection led me to another point that is perhaps the most important. Repentance. Not that heavy, guilt-ridden repentance, but the kind that opens space for spiritual sensitivity, that makes us look inward and realize what needs to be realigned. It's the kind of repentance that cleanses the heart, that casts aside pride, that restores to us the posture of someone who wants to listen, wants to understand, wants to follow the right path. Sometimes the biggest obstacle is not the lack of response, but the lack of sensitivity to recognize it. I realized that before any clear direction, God first calls our attention. And this warning is a form of love, a love that doesn't let us walk blindly towards decisions that could hurt us, distance us, or even paralyze us. He warns us because He sees what we don't see, because He knows beforehand what we will only discover later. And understanding this completely changes how we approach our own choices. It reminds us that the spiritual is not an accessory to life, but its foundation. That what we ignore today may be precisely what defines our tomorrow. And, in a way, while I was going through all of this, I felt as if God was teaching me to breathe again, to slow down, to observe, to respect the signs. Not just the big and obvious ones, but also those that arrive as a whisper, a slight discomfort, a persistent thought, a peace that shouldn't exist, or a restlessness that doesn't want to go away. This sensitivity isn't born